Hi, my name is Heema, and in today's video I'm going to revisit the life and works of one of the greatest treasures of modernist literature and my personal idol, Virginia Woolf. Virginia Woolf was born as Adeline Virginia Stephen on 25th January 1882 to a very rich, affluent and elite family in South Kensington, London. South Kensington, to give you a context, is sort of like the Upper East Side of London. Her father, Sir Leslie Stephen, was a well-known author, critic, historian and mountaineer from a family of distinguished intellectuals. Her mother, Julia Duckworth Stephen, was a model and a philanthropist. She was the niece of the celebrated photographer Julia Margaret Cameron, who she modeled for over 50 of her aunt's portraits. Virginia had three full siblings, Vanessa, Toby and Adrian, and four half-siblings, Laura from her dad's previous marriage, Stella, Gerald and George from her mother's previous marriage. While all of her brothers received formal education, Virginia and her sisters were homeschooled. By homeschool, I mean more like self-educated. They had access to their father's huge library, but it seems that perhaps Woolf was acutely aware of her own lack of formal education because she went on to assert the importance of education for young girls in her essay A Room of One's Own, where she argues that the reason there's a dearth of great women writers, the reason there's such disparity between the number of great works written by men as opposed to the number of great works written by women is perhaps the fact that women did not have the access to the same resources as men. The theme of educational equality is reflected in a lot of her essays and works like Women Novelists, Women and Fiction, Three Guineas and most notably A Room of One's Own. In A Room of One's Own, she says that in order for a woman to be able to write fiction, she must have a lot of money and a room of her own. In doing so, she links fiction and the ability to write it with access to education. If women are given access to education equal to that of men, in a system that values both genders as equal, they can live lives where they can truly be themselves, devoid of any pretensions. In order to attain intellectual freedom, she says, women must be educated like men in a nurturing system that values their gender. The scary part is, this rings true even now in 2019. Perhaps that is the beauty of her writing and of modernist literature in general, that it questions everything. Perhaps this is something that we've forgotten to do in the 21st century. In 1895, Virginia's mother died of influenza and rheumatic fever. Virginia was only 13 at the time, and her mother's death at such a young age was extremely traumatizing and caused her very first mental breakdown and left a deep impact in her life. Her mother features in a lot of her writings. She quotes, "For we think back through our mothers if we are women." Her writing reflects her deep loss. Most famously, she pays tribute to her mother in her book To the Lighthouse in the character of Mrs. Ramsay, which was inspired heavily by her own mother. Virginia's sister Vanessa Bell said that the character of Mrs. Ramsay was a portrait of their mother that was more like their mother than anything she could ever perceive as possible. Mrs. Ramsay dies in the novel as suddenly and as abruptly as Virginia's mother did in real life. After her mother's death, her half-sister Stella Duckworth became a maternal figure in her life, but she too died 2 years later. While dealing with all of these losses, Virginia enrolled in King's College London, where she came in the company of other feminist women working for reforms in women's education. This shaped her views of feminism, which reflect strongly in most of her works thereafter. In 1904, Virginia lost her father to stomach cancer. This was a huge emotional setback for her, leading to institutionalization for a brief period. Shortly after, her brother Toby also died of typhoid. After their father's death, Virginia and her siblings sold their family home and shifted to another house in the Bloomsbury area of London. This is one of the most significant periods of her life, as it is here that she met a group of intellectuals, writers and artists who were like-minded and who called themselves the Bloomsbury Group. Members of this group included Virginia, her sister Vanessa, their to-be husbands Leonard Woolf and Clive Bell, as well as noted authors like E.M. Forster and economist John Keynes. The Bloomsbury Group was famous for its progressive thoughts and ideas, its open support for gay rights and women's rights. Virginia married Leonard Woolf in 1912 at the age of 30, and shortly thereafter she published her very first novel, The Voyage Out, in 1915. 2 years later, in 1917, Virginia and her husband Leonard purchased a second-hand printing press and started their very own publishing house called the kalArt Press. Through the kalArt Press, they not only published their own works but also those of some prominent personalities like Sigmund Freud and T.S. Eliot. Some of Virginia's best works were published thereafter in the 1920s. Mrs. Dalloway in 1925, To the Lighthouse in 1927, Orlando in 1928, A Room of One's Own in 1929, and The Waves in 1931. With each work, she pushed her narrative boundaries even further. It was also in the 1920s that Virginia met fellow writer Vita Sackville-West. Vita was married and she and her husband were both bisexuals and in an open relationship. Vita's companionship had a deep impact on Virginia. Virginia and Vita had a sexual affair starting in 1925 that Leonard and her sister Vanessa knew of but did not object to. For them, Virginia's happiness was paramount. Virginia's novel Orlando, about a gender-crossing aristocrat who lives on for over 300 years, having many relationships with both men and women, was inspired by Vita and Virginia's relationship. Vita's son Nigel Nicholson refers to this novel as the longest and the most charming love letter in literature. Though their relationship did not last very long, Virginia and Vita remained friends till the very end. Virginia suffered through chronic depression for most of her life, starting from her first mental breakdown after her mother's death. Her condition is considered to have been manic depressive disorder or bipolar disorder, where she suffered from periodic mood swings ranging from manic excitement to severe depression. She attempted suicide after her father's death and thereafter constantly lived in the fear of her next mental breakdown. Virginia's writings and her characters reflect her personal thoughts and tumultuous emotions. The character of Septimus Smith from Mrs. Dalloway is one such example. Other than her mother's death, it is also said that Virginia's mental illness may have been a result of her child sexual abuse. Virginia and her sister Vanessa, right from the age of 6, were sexually abused by their half-brothers Gerald and George Duckworth. This sexual abuse was also a reason for Virginia's deep aversion to sex. Coupled with the fact of her mental illness, it was the reason why she and Leonard never had any children. Leonard nursed Virginia through her multiple bouts of depression and numerous suicide attempts. In her suicide note addressed to Leonard, she writes, "You have given me the greatest possible happiness. You have been in every way all that anyone could be. I don't think two people could have been happier till this terrible disease came." Virginia would usually go through the manic stage of her illness while she was writing the novel, and as soon as it was completed, she would become depressed. As Virginia was writing her last novel, Between the Acts, she was getting progressively depressive. It was a difficult time for her with the Second World War raging on around them. Just a year before Virginia's death, her house in London was blown away by a German bombing during the London Blitz. The war took its toll on Virginia's state of mind, which was already delicate at that point. Leonard and Virginia had made a suicide pact that if England was invaded by Germany, both of them would take their lives out of fear for safety of Leonard, who was a Jew. finally unable to cope, on 28th of March 1941, Woolf filled the pockets of her fur coat with rocks and walked into the Ouse River near her house. Although she left behind 2 suicide letters addressed to her sister Vanessa and her husband Leonard, her body was not found till 3 weeks after her death, due to it being swept by the river. Virginia is considered as one of the greatest modernists of the 20th century and a pioneer in the use of stream of consciousness as a narrative device. Stream of consciousness is a literary technique where the focus is on the interior monologue of the character rather than the plot. Virginia wrote a lot of literary masterpieces. Mrs. Dalloway, Orlando, and The Waves are considered to be some of her best works. Personally, my introduction to Virginia was through her essay, A Room of One's Own, which changed my perception of feminism and shaped my ideas about it. The reason behind this reflection is not to romanticize Virginia's mental illness or her death. It is to see that despite all the odds, despite the pain, the grief, and the loss, Virginia stubbornly persisted. She lived and she created. She put out her ideas into the world about her feminism, which were not very welcome and heavily criticized in the early 1900s. It is to see that despite all the odds, Virginia certainly did not go gentle into that good night.